Story, we're joined from London by Hamid Nafees, researcher in radicalization and terrorism. Thanks very much for talking to us on France 24. Radicalization of inmates in prisons is a recurrent problem in France. Can you give us some insight into the roots of that problem and what's being done to tackle it?
Well, prisons are just basically a radicalization hotspot, and you have radicalization hotspots outside of prisons as well. So you have certain neighborhoods that can be radicalization hotspots. You can have different settings, and prisons are one of them. And basically, whether it's a neighborhood outside of prison or whether it's inside prison, the conditions that lead to radicalization hotspots are usually the same. You have a large population of people who basically feel disenfranchised, marginalized. They feel subjugated by the establishment. And so they're angry and they want to lash back. And then if someone that they know, and this is the important part, it's usually someone that they know, that they trust, someone they have a previous relationship with, can be a close friend or a family member, if that person then starts grooming them into a particular radical ideology, that ideology can be particularly persuasive to someone who already has a history of delinquency, who's already angry and wants to lash back at the system. And now they're being given an ideology that basically tells them, you're not the bad guy in this situation just because you're in jail. They're the bad guy. The whole system is corrupt, and this is how you can, in some strange way, redeem yourself through acts of violence, because now you're going to become a religious warrior. You're fighting on the right side of history. So those are the kinds of narratives, but ultimately it has to be transferred through someone they already have some sort of trustful relationship with.
Now, I suppose one question would be, you said yourself, prison is a sort of a perfect kind of, it provides the perfect conditions in some respects for radicalisation. What alternatives then are there? Could perhaps rehabilitation centres be used in the case of profiles where radicalisation is quite likely? And what other models are there? I understand that you've worked, for example, with several governments looking at different approaches to this radicalisation problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to first separate prevention versus rehabilitation. The big problem is, how do you stop people who are not yet radicalized from getting radicalized? A lot of the people who go into prison are not radicalized before they got there. They became radicalized while they were in prison. And so the first and the most simple, the most obvious step is to isolate those people who could be recruiters. The best recruiters are usually not people who radicalize in prison, but actually have a history of radicalization. As I had mentioned earlier, the person needs to have a degree of authority to be giving you these ideas. And oftentimes the best recruiters are people who have been off to Syria or Afghanistan or Pakistan. They have some history and some relationship with terrorism to begin with. And so they're kind of seen as an authority figure. So number one, isolate those people, put them in either solitary confinement or just make sure they're not mixing in whatever way with the general population. Then the second thing is, you need good indicators to be able to tell if someone is radicalizing, which is oftentimes just spending time with that particular individual. And then you need someone who also has trust, someone who also has authority to come in and to try to groom the person out of that ideology. And that's the tricky part, is who can have authority. It's not going to be an imam. It's not going to be a religious scholar. Oftentimes it can be a reformed radical. It doesn't have to be, but it can be someone who was once part of these groups and has now defected because they became disaffected from those groups. And that person usually has more authority because they went through the whole journey and they came back around again, and they can work with that person to kind of walk them off the edge of violence. Once the person has been radicalized, how do you rehabilitate someone? Again, it depends on their degree of radicalization. If some person is maybe just kind of halfway there, they're kind of adopting the ideology and the identity, it's pretty early on in the radicalization process, then there's a variety of things you can do, usually involving non-radical friends and family, to kind of intervene, to act as social anchors to pull this person away from that ideology. But unfortunately, some people are just so radicalized that even rehabilitation centers wouldn't work for them, and so we just have to find a way to quarantine them from the rest of society.
Okay, what do you think of the fact that the Islamic State group in Syria is now shrinking to almost nothing? The caliphate that was so extensive is now, I mean, essentially the battle against the Islamic State group has been very successful on a military level. Is that likely to see support diminish in terms of people feeling less tempted by radicalisation because the cause is now perhaps weakened? What do you think of that?
Well, definitely the appeal of ISIS is much lower today than it was in 2014 or 2015, when their caliphate was growing, when it was able to brand itself as the vanguard anti-establishment movement of our times. It was redrawing the lines from post-colonialization in the Middle East. So there was a high appeal there. And now I would say The appeal has gone down. Yeah, they don't, as a specific group, have the same appeal. But that doesn't mean that radicalization is on the decline. The conditions that led to radicalization are still there. People still feel disaffected. They're still having crises of identity. They still feel like they don't have anything to aspire to in their life. They still have strong anti-establishment sentiments. So they have all the grievances and all the emotions that's there that'll make them easy pickings for a recruiter, especially if there's another civil war, if there's another breakout, if there's another civil war in Iraq or Syria or anywhere else, and there's another call for foreign fighters. So just because the appeal of a particular group has gone down doesn't mean that the conditions have now been alleviated. And in some sense, this is the ideal time for policymakers throughout Europe to start implementing programs to prevent what could be the next wave of radicalization, which will inevitably happen as soon as there's another Syrian civil war type situation. And there's a lot of those potential wars that are looming on the horizon.
Okay, Hamid, Nafees, much more to say on that, I suppose, but thank you for those insights from London.
Thank you.
Now, an insight